Before it became a symbol of American air power, before the posters, the movies, the museum halls, and the stories of crews that somehow made it home, the B-17 Flying Fortress was almost a failure. On a fall morning in 1935, the aircraft that was supposed to change American aviation lifted into the sky from right field. It was bigger, heavier, and more complex than almost anything the Army Air Corps had ever asked to fly. 4 engines, a long silver fuselage, a defensive armament that made reporters call it a flying fortress. Then, moments after takeoff, it stalled. The prototype crashed, 2 men were killed, and for Boeing, it seemed the dream had ended before it truly began. But that crash did not end the story. It changed aviation. From the wreckage of that first Boeing Model 299 came one of the most important habits in modern flight, the checklist, step by step, switch by switch, control by control. The aircraft was not too much machine for human beings. It simply demanded discipline. And in the years that followed, that discipline would carry thousands of young men across the skies of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. They would fly at 25,000 feet in an unpressurized metal tube in temperatures so cold that skin could freeze to steel. They would cross miles of cloud, flak, fighters, fear, and uncertainty. They would fly toward cities they had only seen on maps, toward targets they might never clearly see, and toward a level of danger few of them could have imagined when they signed up. The B-17 was called a fortress, but the truth behind that name is more powerful than the nickname. It was not invincible. It was survivable. And that difference cost thousands of lives. Stay with this story, because the real history of the B-17 Flying Fortress is not just a story about an aircraft. It is a story about ambition, doctrine, industry, courage, and the terrible price of learning what modern air war really meant. In the 1930s, the United States was still trying to understand what air power could become. The First World War had shown that aircraft could scout, strafe, bomb, and fight. But the idea of long-range strategic bombing was still young. Many air power thinkers believed that future wars might be shaped not only by armies on the ground or fleets at sea, but by bombers flying directly against the industrial heart of an enemy nation. Factories, railways, oil plants, shipyards, aircraft production, power systems. The theory was simple, at least on paper. If a nation's ability to make war could be struck from the air, then perhaps a war could be shortened. Perhaps armies could be weakened before they reached the battlefield. Perhaps air power could become decisive. The United States Army Air Corps wanted an aircraft that could reach farther, fly higher, carry a serious bomb load, and defend itself over long distances. In 1934, it issued a requirement for a new bomber. The aircraft needed to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs over more than 1,000 miles at speeds beyond what many existing bombers could manage. Most companies thought in terms of twin-engine aircraft. Boeing thought bigger. Its answer was the Model 299, a 4-engine bomber that looked like it belonged to a future war. It had a long fuselage, a broad wing, multiple defensive gun positions, and enough range to suggest that America might one day project air power far beyond its coasts. When the prototype flew on July 28, 1935, it impressed almost everyone who saw it. The aircraft seemed to embody a new kind of military imagination. It was not a small tactical bomber. It was not built only for the battlefield. It was built for distance. A journalist reportedly looked at its guns and its size and called it a flying fortress. Boeing liked the name. History remembered it. But the Army Air Corps competition was not decided by romance. It was decided by performance, safety, cost, and confidence. After the prototype crash in October, the Army chose the cheaper Douglas B-18 for the main contract. That could have been the end. But the Air Corps had seen enough to remain interested. Boeing received an order for 13 service test aircraft, known as YB-17s, and later further development continued. The B-17 survived because some officers understood what it represented. Not just an airplane, A doctrine. A gamble on the future. The early B-17s were not yet the famous bombers of 1943 and 1944. They were developmental machines. The B-17B, C, and D models still carried the shape of an idea that had not yet been fully tested by war. The B-17B was the first production version in meaningful numbers, but only 39 were ordered. The C model improved engines, systems, and defensive arrangements. Some were sent to Britain, where the Royal Air Force operated them as Fortress Mark Is. That early British experience was sobering. The B-17 was sent into combat before the design had fully matured. At high altitude, over Europe, facing weather, fighters, and operational realities, the Fortress was not yet the unstoppable bomber that American advocates had imagined. It needed better armor, better defensive coverage, better tactics, better formations, better understanding. The B-17D followed, and one surviving aircraft from that line would become famous in its own quiet way. It was called the Swoos. Originally named Old Betsy, this B-17D served in the desperate early months of the Pacific War after Pearl Harbor. While the later reputation of the B-17 would be built mostly over Europe, the Swoos belonged to a different chapter. It flew through the confusion, retreat, adaptation, and survival of the early Pacific campaign. It is the oldest surviving B-17, and it reminds us that the Flying Fortress was not born into triumph. It was born into trial. Then came the model that truly changed the aircraft. The B-17E. With the E model, the Flying Fortress began to look like the aircraft most people now recognize. It had a redesigned tail, improved defensive positions, heavier armament, and a crew of 10. It carried more guns and had better protection. It was a response to the brutal lessons arriving from Europe and the Pacific. The aircraft was becoming less of a theoretical bomber and more of a combat machine. Then came the B-17F, the model made famous by the Memphis Belle. And after that, the B-17G, the definitive wartime version. The G model added one of the most important visible changes: a chin turret beneath the nose. This was not added for style. It was added because German fighter pilots had discovered a deadly weakness: frontal attacks. Against earlier B-17s, especially the F model, attacking from the front reduced the time a bomber's gunners had to react. A fighter closing head-on could pass through the formation at tremendous speed. The nose had less defensive firepower than other areas, and the cockpit, bomb bay, and forward crew were vulnerable. The chin turret was a direct answer to combat experience. That is one of the clearest truths about the B-17. It evolved because men were dying in it. The aircraft was changed by battle. A typical B-17G was about 74 feet long, with a wingspan of just over 103 feet. It was powered by 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, each producing around 1,200 horsepower. It could fly at high altitude, often above 25,000 feet in combat, with a maximum ceiling over 35,000 feet, depending on load and conditions. Its maximum speed was roughly in the high 200s of miles per hour, though wartime performance depended heavily on altitude, bomb load, fuel, and formation requirements. It could carry up to around 8,000 pounds of bombs on shorter missions, but long-distance missions often required a smaller bomb load to allow enough fuel. Its defensive armament reached 1350 caliber machine guns on the B-17G. That number helped create the reputation. 13 heavy machine guns, nose, dorsal turret, ventral ball turret, waist positions, radio room, tail, chin turret. The aircraft seemed to bristle with firepower. But a single B-17 was never meant to be safe alone. The real defensive weapon was the formation. Dozens of bombers flying together in carefully arranged combat boxes could overlap their fields of fire. In theory, any fighter attacking one aircraft might face guns from several others. The formation was armor made of geometry. But it came with a price. A bomber in formation could not maneuver freely. A damaged aircraft that fell behind became exposed. A crew that lost position might be left alone in enemy sky. And during the final bomb run, when the formation had to fly straight and level for accuracy, it became predictable. That was when the flak crews below knew where to aim. Inside the aircraft, the men experienced the war in separate compartments. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side, trying to hold formation through turbulence, engine strain, and fear. The navigator worked from charts and instruments, sometimes with little visual reference. The bombardier waited for the moment when the aircraft would settle into the bomb run, when the Norden bomb sight and the discipline of the formation would decide whether the mission succeeded. The engineer often manned the top turret, watching engine performance and scanning the sky. The radio operator listened through static, handled communication, and sometimes manned a gun. The waist gunners stood in open or semi-open positions, exposed to freezing air and violence from every direction. The tail gunner sat at the far rear of the aircraft, cramped and isolated, staring into the distance behind him. And beneath the aircraft, curled into a small sphere of metal and glass, was the ball turret gunner. There were few positions in the air war more claustrophobic. He entered the turret after takeoff. Inside, there was little room to move. He had to rotate with the turret, track fighters, watch for threats, and trust that the mechanism would bring him back into position before landing. The cold was extreme. The isolation was complete. To understand the B-17, you have to imagine not just the aircraft from the outside, beautiful and powerful in formation. You have to imagine living inside it. No pressurization. Oxygen masks. Heated suits that could fail. Frost on metal. Engine noise so constant it became part of the body. The smell of oil, fuel, cold air, gun smoke, and fear. At altitude, a simple malfunction could become dangerous. A torn oxygen line could leave a man confused or unconscious. Frostbite could happen quickly. A jammed gun could mean helplessness at the worst possible moment. And every man knew that once the bombers crossed into enemy airspace, there was no easy exit. When the United States entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, the B-17 was still available in limited numbers, but America's industrial machine was awakening. Production expanded through Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega. Factories at Seattle, Long Beach, and Burbank became part of a massive system of wartime output. Workers, many of them women, built the aircraft section by section, rivet by rivet, turning strategic theory into aluminum reality. By the end of production, roughly 12,700 B-17s had been built. The commonly cited total is 12,731. That number matters because the B-17 was not just a product of engineering. It was a product of scale. America could build them, train crews for them, fuel them, repair them, replace them, send them overseas, build airfields for them, fill them with bombs, escort them, and send them back again. The Flying Fortress was as much an industrial weapon as it was an aircraft. In the European theater, the B-17 became closely tied to the 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England. Beginning in 1942, American heavy bombers launched daylight attacks against German-occupied Europe. Their mission was different from the Royal Air Force's night bombing campaign. The Americans believed in daylight precision bombing. They believed heavily armed formations could strike specific industrial and military targets. Rail yards, submarine facilities, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil targets, refineries, transport systems. The theory was bold. The reality was more complicated. Weather over Europe was often terrible. Clouds covered targets. Smoke obscured aiming points. Enemy fighters attacked before, during, and after the bomb run. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with bursts of steel. Navigation could be difficult. Bombs dropped from high altitude did not always land close to the intended target. The phrase precision bombing sounds clean. The experience was not. Still, the campaign grew. More bomb groups arrived. More crews trained. More aircraft filled the English countryside. Quiet villages became neighbors to airfields, where engines started before dawn and bombers rolled toward runways in the cold. For the men, each mission began long before takeoff. They woke early, ate what they could, sat through briefing. A curtain would be pulled back to reveal the target. Sometimes there was silence. Sometimes a groan, because some names carried weight. Bremen, Hamburg, Berlin, Regensburg, Schweinfurt. Schweinfurt became one of the most feared. In 1943, the United States Army Air Forces believed that Germany's ball-bearing industry was a critical target. Ball bearings were needed in engines, vehicles, machinery, and weapons. If the plants at Schweinfurt could be crippled, German production might suffer deeply. On August 17, 1943, American bombers launched a massive double strike against Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The plan was ambitious. One force would hit aircraft production at Regensburg, then continue south toward North Africa. Another would strike the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. But timing, weather, and German defenses turned the mission into one of the most costly days of the air war up to that point. 376 B-17s were sent. 60 were lost. Many more returned damaged. A few weeks later, in October, the Americans went back to Schweinfurt. The losses were again devastating. 77 of 291 bombers were lost or written off. Hundreds of men were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The lesson was unavoidable. The Flying Fortress could defend itself, but not enough. Not deep over Germany, without fighter escort. This is one of the most important turning points in the B-17 story. It is where courage met doctrine. The crews had done what they were asked to do. They had flown into enemy airspace, held formation, fought back, and pressed on to the target. But bravery could not erase mathematics. If losses continued at that level, the campaign could not be sustained. For a time, deep penetration raids were limited. The idea that bomber formations alone could fight their way across Germany had been badly shaken. Then came the long-range escorts. The P-51 Mustang, with drop tanks and range enough to accompany bombers deep into enemy territory, changed the air war. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning also played roles, but the Mustang became the aircraft most closely associated with turning the tide over Europe. Now German fighters could not attack the bomber stream with the same freedom. They had to fight escorts before reaching the bombers, and later they were hunted over their own airfields. The mission of the fighters also changed. They were no longer just guarding bombers. They were destroying the Luftwaffe. By 1944, the strategic bombing campaign entered a new phase. The bombers still faced flak, weather, navigation problems, and losses, but the balance had shifted. The German fighter force was being worn down. Experienced pilots were harder to replace. Fuel shortages grew worse. Training declined. The B-17 was no longer flying alone into the heart of the enemy. It was part of a system. Bombers, fighters, intelligence, production, maintenance, airfields, radar, logistics, replacement crews, fuel, training, command decisions, target priorities. That system became overwhelming. During Big Week in February 1944, American bombers and fighters attacked German aircraft factories and related targets. The German aircraft industry was not destroyed in a simple, instant way. In fact, German production could recover and disperse. But the Luftwaffe had to rise to defend the Reich, and when it rose, Allied fighters engaged it. The air war became a battle of attrition Germany could not afford. Then the target priorities shifted toward oil and transportation. This was one of the most strategically important changes of the war. Germany needed fuel for aircraft, tanks, trucks, training, and movement. Synthetic oil plants and refineries became vital targets. When Allied bombers attacked oil production repeatedly, the effects spread through the German war machine. Aircraft could be built, but not flown enough. Pilots could exist, but not trained properly. Units could be organized, but not moved efficiently. Transportation attacks added another layer. Rail yards, bridges, and transport nodes were hit to disrupt movement of troops and supplies. The B-17's impact was greatest when it was used not as a mythical war-ending weapon, but as part of a sustained campaign against carefully chosen systems. That distinction matters, because after the war, The United States Strategic Bombing Survey studied the bombing campaign in detail. It found that no single attack usually destroyed an industrial system permanently. Factories were repaired. Production was dispersed. Workers adapted. German industry was resilient. But repeated attacks against the right targets, under pressure from all sides, created cumulative damage. Strategic bombing worked best when it was persistent, not magical, not clean, not independent of the rest of the war. Persistent. That is the real military story of the B-17. But the human story is found inside individual aircraft. One of the most famous was the Memphis Belle, a B-17F, named after pilot Robert Morgan's girlfriend and decorated with nose art. The Memphis Belle became a symbol because it completed 25 combat missions and returned to the United States. At the time, 25 missions marked a full combat tour for bomber crews in the European theater. Today, that number may sound small. It was not. For many crews in the early phase of the campaign, completing 25 missions was an extraordinary achievement. In the first year of operations over Germany, only a minority of crews reached that mark. The Memphis Belle was sent home for a war bond tour. It became a public face of the air war. Americans saw the aircraft, met the crew, and connected the distant bombing campaign to real young men. But the Memphis Belle also shows how memory is built. The aircraft became famous because it arrived at the right moment, with the right story and the right need for morale. The public needed a symbol. The Memphis Belle became one. Another B-17 became famous for a different reason. The All-American. In February 1943, during operations over North Africa, a B-17F of the 97th Bomb Group was severely damaged after an encounter involving a German fighter. The aircraft's tail section was nearly cut away. Photographs of the bomber in flight, with its rear fuselage torn open and tail still attached, became among the most astonishing images of the war. The popular version of the story often sounds almost impossible. A B-17 sliced nearly in half, still flying home, crew surviving, aircraft landing against all odds. The core of the story is real. The aircraft did return. The damage was extraordinary. But the details have been repeated and embellished over the decades. Some accounts simplify the collision. Others confuse related aircraft and events. The truth is dramatic enough without turning it into fantasy. That is something every serious documentary should respect. The B-17 could absorb severe punishment. There are many photographs of aircraft returning with missing sections, damaged engines, shredded control surfaces, and holes across the fuselage. But every famous return also hides another reality. For every aircraft that came back in a photograph, others did not come back at all. Survivor stories are powerful because they are exceptions, not guarantees. Then there is the story of Ye Old Pub. On December 20th, 1943, a B-17F, piloted by Charles Brown, was badly damaged during a mission over Bremen. The aircraft was hit hard. Its formation was gone. Its crew was wounded and exhausted. Its defensive ability was compromised. A German fighter pilot, Franz Stigler, found the crippled bomber. He had the opportunity to shoot it down. He did not. Instead, after seeing the condition of the aircraft and crew, he chose to spare them. He flew near the B-17 for part of its journey, then let it go. Years later, Brown and Stigler would meet. The story is often told as a rare moment of humanity inside total war. It should be told carefully, not as a way to soften the nature of the conflict and not as a way to romanticize the enemy, but as a reminder that even inside systems of destruction, individual human choices still existed. One pilot saw an aircraft that was no longer a true combat threat, and he chose restraint. That moment is unforgettable because it was rare. Most encounters in the skies over Europe did not end that way. Most were decided in seconds. A flash of movement. A fighter at 12 o'clock. A burst of tracers. A call over the interphone. An engine losing power. A formation closing ranks. a man counting parachutes and hoping he saw 10. The B-17's reputation for toughness came not only from design, but from the men who kept damaged aircraft flying. Pilots learned how to nurse crippled engines. Engineers transferred fuel and monitored systems. Gunners kept firing, even when cold and exhaustion slowed their hands. Navigators found routes home with damaged instruments. Radio operators sent distress calls through static. Crews threw loose equipment overboard to reduce weight. They patched, improvised, and prayed in whatever way they knew how. Sometimes they reached England. Sometimes they reached the Channel. Sometimes they ditched in water. Sometimes they landed in neutral territory. Sometimes they became prisoners. Sometimes nothing was heard. The cost was immense, and yet crews kept climbing into the aircraft. That fact is difficult to fully understand from a distance. Some were motivated by duty, some by loyalty to their crew, some by patriotism, some by the desire to finish the required number of missions and go home, some by the simple reality that everyone around them was doing the same. The bomber crew was a small society. 10 men, 1 aircraft, shared danger. If one man failed, others might not survive. If one man stayed calm, others might live. The B-17 demanded teamwork in the purest and most unforgiving form. This is why its story still holds attention. Not because it was the most efficient aircraft in every category. It was not. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, for example, had greater production numbers and offered important technical advantages. It could carry heavy loads, fly long distances, and in some respects was more efficient. Its Davis wing gave it strong, high-speed, long-range performance. In many theaters, especially over vast ocean distances, the B-24 was essential. But the B-17 won a different contest. The contest of memory. Its name was better. Its shape was more iconic. Its combat photographs were unforgettable. Its stories of damaged aircraft returning home became symbols of American endurance. Its association with the 8th Air Force over Europe gave it a central place in the public imagination. The B-24 may have been more numerous. The B-17 became the legend. But a responsible telling has to separate legend from reality. The B-17 was not a flying tank. It was not safe. It was not always accurate. Its defensive guns did not make it immune. Its bomb loads were not always the largest. It required enormous maintenance. It could be difficult to fly when damaged. And early in the European campaign, it suffered losses that forced commanders to rethink tactics. The daylight bombing campaign itself remains debated. Supporters argued that it struck the German war economy, forced Germany to divert fighters and anti-aircraft guns to defense, weakened the Luftwaffe, and helped prepare the conditions for the Allied advance. Critics point to the human cost, the limits of bombing accuracy, civilian casualties, and the gap between pre-war promises and wartime results. Both truths can exist. Strategic bombing did not work exactly as its strongest advocates predicted, but it did matter. It became most effective when combined with air superiority, better target selection, long-range escort, and pressure from land and sea. That is the mature lesson of the B-17. The aircraft was not the whole war. It was one part of a vast machine. A machine powered by industry and strategy, but endured by human beings. If you're still watching at this point, that's the part worth remembering. The aircraft is famous because of metal, engines, and history, but it matters because of the people inside it. Imagine a mission day in 1944. Before dawn, the airbase is dark and cold. Ground crews have worked through the night. Fuel trucks have come and gone. Bombs have been loaded. Armorers have checked guns and ammunition. Mechanics have inspected engines that must carry 10 men across hostile sky and bring them home again. The crews arrive in heavy flight gear. They are young, but many already look older than they are. At briefing, they learn the target. A red line on a map crosses the North Sea or the Channel, moves through enemy defenses, and ends at an industrial city deep inside occupied Europe or Germany itself. The men listen. They know the route tells them almost everything. How long they will be exposed, how much fighter opposition is expected, how much flak, whether the target has been hit before, whether the Germans will be waiting. Then they go to their aircraft. Each bomber has a name. Some are funny, some sentimental, some defiant, some decorated with nose art. These names mattered. They turned serial numbers into personalities. A crew did not simply board a machine, they boarded their machine. Engines start one by one. The sound builds across the airfield until the whole base seems to vibrate. A B-17 rolling for takeoff is heavy with fuel, bombs, ammunition, and men. It lifts slowly, gathering itself into the morning sky. One bomber follows another, then another, then another. Over England, they assemble into formation. This alone is dangerous. Aircraft must find their assigned positions in cloud, cold, and crowded airspace. A mistake can cause collision. A delay can expose a group. The bomber stream forms gradually, turning toward enemy territory. At altitude, the cold arrives fully. The oxygen masks go on. Conversation becomes short. Eyes scan the sky. Some men watch for fighters. Some watch engine gauges. Some watch the formation. Some watch the horizon and say nothing. Then, the flak begins. At first, black bursts in the distance. Then closer. Then around them. Anti-aircraft fire does not need to hit directly to be dangerous. Shells explode nearby, throwing fragments through the air. A bomber can be holed in dozens of places without a single dramatic impact. A hydraulic line can be cut, a control cable damaged, an engine wounded, a man injured, a bomb bay door jammed. The aircraft keeps flying. That is the nature of the B-17 story. Damage accumulates, but the mission continues. Then fighters appear, sometimes as specks, sometimes as sudden shapes. German pilots learn to attack with discipline. Head-on passes, slashing attacks, coordinated movement, rockets, cannon fire. The bomber crews answer with machine guns, formation fire, and warnings shouted through the interphone. The sky becomes a place of calculation and instinct. Seconds matter. A fighter crosses too fast to think about as a person. It is angle, speed, distance, threat. Then it is gone. Or the bomber is hit. Still, the formation moves toward the target. On the bomb run, the aircraft must hold steady. This is one of the strangest and most frightening moments of the mission. After hours of danger, the bomber must fly straight. The bombardier takes over through the bomb site. The formation aligns. The target is ahead. Evasive movement is limited. The men know the flak crews below understand this too. The bomb bay doors open. Cold air surges. The bombs fall. The aircraft jumps lighter. For some crews, there is relief. For others, the worst is still ahead. Because dropping the bombs does not mean safety. They still have to go home. Damaged aircraft may fall behind. Fighters may wait for stragglers. Engines may fail over water. Weather over England may close in. Landing a damaged B-17 could be its own ordeal. When the bombers returned, ground crews counted them. A missing aircraft was not an abstract loss. It was an empty hardstand. A silent crew hut. Beds that did not need to be made. Personal items left behind. The public saw formations. The men on the bases saw absences. That is why the reputation of the Flying Fortress must be handled with respect. The name suggested safety. The statistics did not. In the early campaigns, finishing a tour was never certain. The number of required missions changed over time, and survival odds shifted as escorts improved and tactics changed. But for those who flew before long-range fighter protection became reliable, the danger was severe. And yet, the B-17 kept going. By 1945, Germany was collapsing under pressure from all directions. Soviet forces advanced from the east. Allied armies moved from the west. The sea war had turned. The Luftwaffe was weakened, fuel shortages were severe, transport networks were battered, industrial systems were strained. The B-17 had helped create that pressure. Not alone. Never alone. But unmistakably. It forced Germany to defend its skies. It attacked aircraft production, oil, transportation, and military infrastructure. It helped open the way for Allied air superiority. It became a visible sign that the war could reach the German homeland every day. For German civilians, the sound of heavy bombers meant fear and destruction. For American crews, the same sound meant duty and risk. For commanders, it meant strategy. For the American public, it meant resolve. That is why the aircraft carries such complicated meaning. It is heroic and tragic, technological and human, strategic and moral, beautiful in formation, terrifying in purpose. After the war, many B-17s were scrapped. The world moved quickly into the jet age. New bombers were faster, higher, more advanced. The Flying Fortress became obsolete as a frontline weapon almost as soon as peace returned. But it did not disappear. Some were used for search and rescue, reconnaissance, testing, drone control, and other post-war roles. Others became firebombers, transports, or museum aircraft. A few survived long enough to be restored, displayed, and flown as living history. Today, when people stand beneath a B-17 in a museum, they often notice its size first. But if they look longer, something else appears. The aircraft is large, but the crew spaces are small. The skin is metal, but thin. The guns are many, but exposed. The machine looks powerful from a distance and fragile up close. That contrast is the truth. The B-17 Flying Fortress was one of the most important bombers of the Second World War. It helped define American strategic bombing. It became the symbol of the 8th Air Force. It influenced doctrine, production, and the public image of air power. But its greatest story is not that it was impossible to destroy. Its greatest story is that so many flew it anyway. The men who climbed into those aircraft did not know whether they would become heroes, statistics, prisoners, survivors, or names on a wall. They knew only the mission in front of them. They trusted their crew, their training, their aircraft, and sometimes luck. The Flying Fortress was built from aluminum, engines, guns, cables, glass, and rivets. Its story was built from mornings when crews took off into uncertainty, from damaged aircraft crossing the channel, from ground crews waiting in the cold, from photographs of torn fuselages and missing engines, from the Memphis Belle returning home, from the Swoos surviving the early Pacific War, from the All-American refusing to fall, from Ye Old Pub being spared by an enemy pilot in one of the war's rare moments of mercy, and from thousands of aircraft and crews whose names are less remembered but whose missions formed the true weight of the campaign. The B-17 was called a fortress, but no fortress flies without men inside it. And no American story of industrial power, courage, and endurance should be told without remembering the cost of becoming one.